My name is Claire. I'm 30 years old, and I teach 7th grade English at a middle school in a small town in Ohio. Last spring, I drove 2 hours to attend my half-sister's engagement dinner at one of the most expensive restaurants in Columbus. I wore a blue dress I had bought 3 years ago and told myself I looked fine. I sat at the far end of the long table, between a distant cousin I barely knew and an empty chair. And then, about 40 minutes into the evening, my half-sister stood up, raised her glass, and looked directly at me. She smiled the way she always smiled when she was about to say something she knew would land. "Oh, and this is Claire," she announced to the table, to her fiancé's family, to everyone. "She's a school teacher, a middle school one." She laughed a little. Bless her heart. A few people smiled politely. Someone at the far end of the table chuckled quietly. I kept my expression calm. I lifted the corner of my mouth into something that probably looked like a smile and nodded once. But then something happened that I did not expect at all. Across the table, an older man with silver-streaked hair and a dark blue suit had gone completely still. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't looking at my half-sister. He was looking at me, carefully, the way someone looks at a word they know they should recognize but can't quite read. Before I tell you what he remembered, please like this video and subscribe to HeartPath Stories, and leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. My father remarried when I was 9 years old. My stepmother was a perfectly pleasant woman, and her daughter, my half-sister Vanessa, was 6 at the time. We grew up in the same house for 8 years. We shared a bathroom, a dinner table, and almost nothing else. Vanessa was loud where I was quiet. She was confident where I was careful. She wore her ambition the way some people wear perfume. You could sense it before she even walked into the room. I never resented her for it. We were just very different people shaped by very different circumstances. My mother had passed away when I was 5, and my father, though he tried his best, was the kind of man who showed love by providing rather than by being present. When he married my stepmother, his attention shifted naturally toward his new family, toward Vanessa, toward building something that felt whole and intact. I understood. I really did. What I didn't always understand was Vanessa's need to measure everything. Every holiday, every family gathering, every phone call seemed to include some gentle accounting of who had done more, earned more, become more. She had graduated from Ohio State with a business degree, moved to Columbus, climbed quickly through a financial consulting firm, and was now, at 27, something impressive with a title I could never fully remember. She was engaged to a man named Daniel, whose family came from old money and ran a regional manufacturing company. I taught 7th grade English. I drove a 2016 Honda Civic with a dent on the rear bumper. I graded papers on Sunday evenings with a cup of coffee and a candle that smelled like cedar. I was not impressive by the measures Vanessa used, but I loved my job. There is nothing in this world quite like watching a 12-year-old who hated reading sit down with a book and forget to look at the clock. Nothing like a kid who thought they had nothing to say find the exact words they were looking for. I had been doing this work for 7 years, and if you had asked me in any one of those years whether I was happy, I would have told you yes without hesitating. The engagement dinner was held at a restaurant called Aldgate, which had white tablecloths and a menu with no prices on it. I had looked it up online beforehand and almost turned around in the parking lot. But I had promised my father I would come, and so I walked in carrying a card with a gift certificate inside and found my name written in careful calligraphy on a little folded tent at the far end of the table. The restaurant was beautiful in the way that places are beautiful when someone has spent a great deal of money making them look effortless. Candlelight moved softly across the room. The glasses were tall and thin. The centerpieces were white flowers I didn't know the names of. Daniel's family occupied most of the left side of the table, his parents, 2 aunts, a younger brother, and the man with the silver-streaked hair who was introduced early in the evening as Daniel's uncle, a man named Mr. Harmon. He ran a regional logistics and warehousing company that, from what I overheard, employed several hundred people across 3 states. My stepmother sat near the center of the table and beamed. My father sat beside her, looking proud in the way he always looked proud of Vanessa, as though she had confirmed something he had always hoped was true. I smiled at both of them when I sat down, and my father waved warmly from across the table. I waved back. For the first 30 minutes or so, everything moved normally. Menus arrived, wine was poured, introductions were made and then slowly forgotten. The conversation on Daniel's family's side of the table stayed mostly among themselves, business things, travel things, a recent trip someone had taken to Portugal. I listened without contributing much. The cousin beside me was nice but distracted by his phone. Vanessa moved through the room like she owned it. She touched Daniel's arm when she laughed. She leaned toward his mother, with the exact right amount of warmth. She was, I had to admit, very good at this. Social situations were her natural element in the same way that a quiet classroom was mine. The first course arrived. A small bowl of something elegant that I ate carefully so as not to make a sound. Conversation floated up and down the table. I had just taken a sip of water when Vanessa tapped her glass with a small spoon. The sound rang out gently, and the table quieted. I just want to say, Vanessa began, her voice warm and assured, how grateful I am that everyone is here tonight. Both families, together. She smiled at Daniel, and he smiled back. Then she looked around the table, and her eyes landed on me. I set down my water glass. I especially want to introduce my sister to Daniel's family, she said, gesturing toward me. This is Claire. She paused just long enough for the pause to mean something. She's a school teacher. Another small pause. Middle school. And then, with a little laugh that was perfectly calibrated to sound affectionate, while landing like something else entirely, bless her heart, she's very dedicated. A few people smiled. Someone said, that's sweet. Someone else said, middle school. Oh goodness, I don't know how anyone does that. The polite, dismissive kind of acknowledgement that ends a conversation before it begins. I smiled. I said thank you. I did not say anything else. But, across the table, Mr. Harmon had gone quiet in a way that was different from the general quiet around him. He had been cutting something on his plate, and then he simply stopped. His fork rested at an angle. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't immediately name. Not unkind. Not curious in the casual way. Something more focused than that. I noticed it but looked away. The conversation moved on. Daniel's mother asked Vanessa about the wedding venue. My father asked about the honeymoon. The second course arrived on white plates with careful arrangements of color. I was listening to a story someone was telling about a vacation in Maine when I glanced across the table again and found that Mr. Harmon was still watching me. He looked away when our eyes met, and for a moment he was quiet and still in the way of someone trying to retrieve a memory that keeps slipping just out of reach. Daniel leaned toward him from the side. You doing okay, Uncle Ray? Mr. Harmon nodded slowly. Fine, fine, he said. Just thinking. About what? Daniel asked. The older man shook his head slightly. Nothing yet, he said. Vanessa didn't notice any of this. She was describing the floral arrangements she had chosen for the reception, hydrangeas and eucalyptus, very clean, very modern. Her future mother-in-law was nodding with genuine interest. My father had his arm around my stepmother's chair. The candles on the table burned in small, steady flames. I told myself the moment had passed. I turned back to my plate and tried to engage the cousin beside me in conversation about something, anything. But then, about 10 minutes later, Mr. Harmon set down his wine glass and looked at Daniel. Remind me, he said quietly. What did she say your fiancé's sister does? She's a teacher, Daniel said. Middle school. Mr. Harmon repeated the words under his breath. Middle school. He said it the way you say a word you're sure you've heard before in a context you can't quite place. Vanessa looked over from her end of the table. Oh, don't worry about Claire, she said pleasantly. She's very happy in her little school. She loves her kids. The tone was the same as before, not cruel, exactly. Just the kind of gentle, well-meaning condescension that assumes you're agreeing with it. Mr. Harmon didn't respond to that. He looked down at the table for a moment. Then he looked at me again, with slightly more certainty this time, and said, I'm sorry, I don't mean to stare. But have we met before? I feel like I know your face from somewhere. The table around us continued its conversations. Someone laughed at the other end. The bread basket was passed again. I'm not sure, I said honestly. I teach in Millfield, over in Athens County. You might have come through at some point. He shook his head slowly, still thinking. No, it's not that. He rubbed the side of his jaw. It's something specific. Like, I saw you at a moment I haven't forgotten. He paused. A particular moment. She meets a lot of people through school, I'm sure, Vanessa offered with a light laugh. Lots of parents, lots of kids. Mr. Harmon nodded politely at Vanessa, but his expression didn't change. He was still working on something. The third course arrived. Plates were swapped out. Fresh wine was poured. Two of Daniel's aunts began a cheerful argument about whether Italy or France was the better honeymoon destination. The conversation at the table swelled and brightened, and the moment with Mr. Harmon seemed to subside into the general noise of the evening. I relaxed slightly. I ate. I listened. I laughed at the right moments. But I kept noticing, in the corner of my vision, that Mr. Harmon was only half present in the conversations around him. He was listening, responding, smiling in the right places. But there was a part of his attention that was still elsewhere, still searching. At one point, Daniel's younger brother asked Mr. Harmon something about a warehouse expansion in Kentucky, and the older man answered clearly and confidently, and then, in almost the same breath, turned to me and said quietly, "Did you ever teach at a school called Fairview Elementary?" I shook my head. "No, I've only ever taught at Lincoln Middle in Millfield." He nodded once. Looked down. Still not satisfied. "How long have you been teaching?" he asked. 7 years, I said. "Did you ever have a student named Marcus?" he asked. And then he stopped himself. Marcus Harmon? The name landed somewhere deep in my chest. I looked at him. 7 years. 300 and something students across all those years, and still, there are ones you never forget. Not because they were the easiest, but because they were the ones who stayed with you longest. The ones who took something out of you and gave back something more. The ones who made you understand, in the most concrete possible way, why you had chosen this work. Marcus Harmon had been in my third-year class. He was 11 years old, and he came to me reading at a second-grade level. He had been passed along quietly from class to class, the kind of kid who learned early to stay invisible so that his struggle wouldn't become a spectacle. He was quiet and careful, and had the specific kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from years of practice at going unnoticed. I had noticed him within the first 2 weeks. I started staying after school with him, on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Not because anyone asked me to. Not because there was any formal program or extra funding. Because he was sitting in my classroom and struggling, and I was his teacher, and that was the only reason I needed. I bought workbooks with my own money. I found audiobooks for the novels we were reading in class, so he could listen at home and not fall behind. I called his father a single dad who worked long hours and was, I could tell from our conversations, doing his absolute best with very limited time to check in every other week. I rearranged my own Saturdays twice to sit with Marcus in the public library and work through whatever he was finding most difficult that week. By spring, Marcus was reading at grade level. Not just reading, he was writing. He wrote a personal essay at the end of the year about a camping trip he had taken with his father, and it was so quiet and careful and true that I had read it twice sitting at my kitchen table and thought, this is why. At the end of the year, he had slipped a card under my classroom door. On the front, in his own handwriting, still a little uneven but fully his. Thank you for not giving up on me. Inside, he had drawn a small picture of a library. I still had that card in my desk at home. I had not known his father's last name. I had spoken to him by first name only Ray. He had told me to call him Ray in those check-in calls. He worked in logistics. I knew that much. He had apologized more than once for not being able to come to parent-teacher conferences because of work travel. I had not known that Ray was short for Raymond. That Raymond Harmon ran a company of several hundred people. That he was sitting across from me at a candlelit table in Columbus while his nephew got engaged. I just knew that Marcus had learned to read in my classroom, and that it had mattered. I looked at Mr. Harmon and said carefully, yes. I had Marcus in my English class. About 4 years ago. The table had not gone quiet. No one had stopped talking. The conversation around us was still warm and lively, Daniel's mother laughing at something, Vanessa saying something about honeymoon suites. But Mr. Harmon had gone completely still. He looked at me for a long moment. Something moved across his face that was hard to describe, like watching a man understand something that had been sitting just outside his comprehension for a very long time. "I knew it," he said. And his voice was different now, lower, slower, like he was speaking from somewhere he didn't go very often. Daniel turned toward his uncle, curious. "Knew what?" Mr. Harmon didn't answer right away. He picked up his wine glass, set it back down without drinking, and looked at Daniel with an expression that had nothing polished about it. He looked like a man who was about to say something true. "4 years ago," he said, "my son Marcus was failing 7th grade English." His voice was steady but quiet, and something in the quality of it made the conversation on either side of us slow and then stop. He had been struggling to read for years. Since 2nd grade. Nobody caught it, or, if they caught it, nobody did much about it. The table was listening now. Vanessa had turned in her chair. My father had set down his fork. "He came home one October," Mr. Harmon continued, "and told me his teacher was staying after school with him. Just the two of them. Reading. Going over things together." He paused. "I called the school and found out it was voluntary. Unpaid. She was just doing it because she had decided that was what Marcus needed." He looked at me. "She called me every other week to give me updates. She bought him books with her own money. She met him at the library on her days off." He exhaled slowly. "My son passed 7th grade. He went to 8th grade reading at the right level. He finished high school. He started college last fall." His voice tightened slightly at the end, the way it does when something is almost more than you can hold in a sentence. "He is studying journalism. Because he loves to write." The silence at the table was complete. "I never knew her last name," Mr. Harmon said. "I called to thank the school at the end of that year and talked to the principal, but by then she had left for the summer. I always thought I'd find some way to reach her properly." He looked at me with the steady, open expression of a man who has been carrying gratitude for a long time and has finally found somewhere to put it. "And here she is." No one moved. "She did all of that," he said, "on her own time. With her own money, because she is a teacher. And that is what teachers do when they decide a child is worth fighting for." Then he turned his head, slowly and deliberately, and looked at Vanessa. His expression didn't change dramatically. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform anything. He simply looked at her and said, calmly and clearly, "You introduced her as a school teacher like it was something small." Vanessa's face had gone very still. "It isn't small," he said. "What she did for my son changed the direction of his life. Permanently. There is no version of Marcus's story where he becomes who he is becoming without what she gave him." He paused once more. "You should know who is sitting at your table." Nobody laughed. Nobody said that's sweet. Nobody moved to change the subject. My father was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not pride, exactly. Something quieter and more complicated than pride. Something that looked like recognition. Daniel stood up from his chair. He walked around the edge of the table and stopped beside me and extended his hand. "I've heard about Marcus my whole life," he said. "He talks about the teacher who stayed after school with him like she was the reason everything turned out okay." He paused. "I think that might be because she was." I shook his hand. I felt the warmth behind it, how much he meant it. "I was just doing my job," I said, and I meant that too. Not as modesty, as the truest thing I knew how to say. Mr. Harmon shook his head gently. "No," he said. "You are doing far more than your job. And I think you've always known the difference." He reached across the table and extended his own hand, and I took it. "Thank you, Claire." Properly. Finally, thank you. The room was beginning to exhale around us. Daniel's mother reached over and squeezed her husband's arm. One of the aunts pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth. The cousin beside me was no longer looking at his phone. Vanessa had not said a word. She was sitting in her chair with her hands folded on the table in front of her, and the careful, polished confidence she had carried all evening was simply gone. She looked younger somehow. Smaller, not in a way that made me feel anything like victory. Just smaller. The way people look when something has interrupted the story they were telling about themselves. I didn't look at her for long. I didn't need to. My father cleared his throat softly from across the table. He wasn't much for speeches. He was a quiet man who had spent most of his life showing love by working and providing rather than by saying things out loud. But he looked at me across the white tablecloth and the candlelight and said, "I didn't know about any of that, Claire." "I know," I said. "I should have," he said. I looked at him and nodded once. That was enough. That was more than enough. The dinner continued. More plates arrived. The band in the corner of the restaurant began playing something soft. Conversation gradually returned to the table, warmer and somehow more careful than it had been before. Like people choosing their words with slightly more attention than they had been using earlier in the evening. Mr. Harmon spent the rest of the night talking with me properly. He told me about Marcus's first semester at college, a communications program in Cincinnati. He told me Marcus had sent him an article he'd written for the school paper and that he had read it 3 times. He told me Marcus still talked about 7th grade English. He pulled out his phone and showed me a photo of Marcus at 18, tall and smiling, standing in front of a university building on move-in day, and something in my chest opened up in the quiet, uncomplicated way it does when you get to see how a story turned out. I told him about the card Marcus had left under my door, about the drawing of the library on the front. Mr. Harmon closed his eyes for a moment when I described it. When he opened them, they were bright. "That's Marcus," he said. "That's exactly Marcus." Vanessa spoke to me once more before the evening ended. She found me near the coat check while everyone was saying their goodbyes. She stood in front of me for a moment without saying anything, and then she said, "I didn't know." "I know," I said. She looked like she wanted to say something more, and maybe she would, in time. Maybe this was the beginning of something different between us, or maybe it was just one evening, and we would go back to being what we had always been, 2 people shaped by the same house, and almost nothing else. I didn't know. I wasn't angry. I was just tired in the pleasant, full way you get tired after a long and meaningful day. I drove home that night through 2 hours of dark Ohio highway with the windows cracked and the radio playing something low. I thought about Marcus in Cincinnati, writing articles. I thought about the way Mr. Harmon's voice had changed when he said my son started college last fall. I thought about the cards still sitting in my desk drawer at home, the library drawn in careful 11-year-old lines. I had not walked into that restaurant expecting anything. I had worn a 3-year-old dress and brought a gift certificate and sat at the end of the table and expected to be exactly what I had always been in Vanessa's world, present but peripheral. Background. I was a 7th grade English teacher. I drove a dented Civic. I graded essays on Sunday nights. And somewhere in Cincinnati, a young man who had once sat in the back of my classroom afraid to read out loud was writing his own stories now, was putting his name at the top of his own pages. I thought about that the whole drive home. There is a certain kind of work that the world doesn't always know how to measure. It doesn't come with titles that sound impressive at dinner parties, or salaries that make people nod with respect, or bylines, or portfolios, or anything you can hold in your hand. It comes in smaller moments. In a child reading a sentence slowly and then faster. In a Tuesday afternoon in October, when everyone else has gone home. In a card slipped under a door. You can spend a whole life doing work like that, and the world might never make a fuss about it. But the people you did it for, they remember. They always remember. And sometimes, when you least expect it, in the middle of a candlelit restaurant on a Tuesday night in spring, the world catches up.